I just let me just pour this. So what do I do now? Do I share my presentation on the screen, right?
You work in IT. You should know this stuff.
I haven't done one of these before. Does that work?
No. Little button at the bottom says share screen. It's like a square with an up arrow.
Oh, it says the word share.
Yeah.
Cool.
So juice.
Good guys.
Yay. Cool.
Good. I can't see any of you though, by the way. Does that matter?
No, it doesn't matter at all. We can see your presentation, and yeah, you can turn your camera off, but that's fine.
Oh, I turned my camera off.
You've turned it off, but yeah.
Oh, I didn't mean. There's a little show tell in a bit potentially.
Ah, cool.
Steve, I love the reference.
Thanks. They're all music-related titles for my beers, so why not this? All right, I'm gonna get cracking. Pressure fermenting. Yeah, I came across it about 3 years ago in a Beersmith podcast thing when I was making lagers and they were kind of going off and they were fruity, all that kind of thing. All the troubles we were having with lagers early on, and it changed the way I fermented lagers really. And then after that, other beers styles as well. So I'm just gonna run through this. So what I'll cover is what it is, how it works, what it is, it's a thing, and why you might want to try it, because there are lots of great benefits. How it works, there's going to be some science and numbers and diagrams, actual proper science. Look at what you need if you want to get started. You can get started relatively cheap, and we'll look at a few cost levels, a few different kinds of kit to get started. And then a kind of what next, because this is kind of a work in progress, really. There's some good research I've come across, but there's still a lot, I think, to learn from for the homebrewers side, for us to learn from. So do contribute, chat on Slack. And I'm going to keep investigating because I want to use it as part of my process going forward for things. Caveats. It's not a magic bullet as such, so it's not going to give you a perfect ferment, and everything else applies. So, you know, pay attention to your sanitation, temperature control, mash pH, recipe, all those things, all those normal things. They all need to have their attention paid to as well. So I'm running two computers. I'm reading the notes off another screen on another computer. Bear with me. What is it? It is fermenting in a closed vessel using a spunding valve as opposed to an airlock. And the difference is you capture the CO2 that is produced during the fermentation, you keep it in the closed vessel. So you'll have pressure from the fermentation kept within the vessel. Closed vessels include, from left to right, corny keg, you might recognize that. Fermzilla type conical plastic guy. I have a couple of those, or 2 or 3 of those. Which is my thing of choice at the minute. There's a fancy schmancy stainless steel Unitank there. And public service announcement, you can't use glass. Don't use glass, because glass and pressure do not mix. Probably doesn't take much to imagine what happens when they do mix. So don't. That's all I'm going to say on that one. Benefits. Let's see why you might be interested. A few benefits, really. It speeds up for your fermentation, and has a built-in diacetyl rest. That's because you can ferment at a higher temperature. It also suppresses any off flavors. There are fewer produced, and they are cleaned up quicker at higher temperatures as well. Because you're in a closed vessel, you can retain more hop aroma. So that's great for hoppy beers, for example. So I should have said suppresses off flavors is great for cleaner beers and beers you don't want esters in, or very low esters in, like lagers. Retains more hoppy aroma. That's good for IPAs, pale ales, all that kind of business. It's great for keeping out oxygen, bugs, dust, all those things that you don't want in it. It will reduce the krausen, so the pressure will actually keep the krausen lower than it would normally be. Gives you a bit of headroom, extra headroom in your fermenter. Useful if you're going to be doing it in a corny keg where you can't see. So it's useful to know. And we'll look at all of these benefits in a bit more detail later as well. It self-carbonates, which is Reinheitsgebot friendly for those people who are in Germany or want to brew in Germany or certain parts of Germany and have a authentic German lager. You can also ferment, carbonate, and serve from the same vessel, so less cleaning up because I'm lazy. One of the main things that people like about it, and the thing that draws most people, and the thing that drew me, as I was mentioning, is you can ferment clean tasting lager at room temperature much more easily than you can traditional method, I would say. But you can also use pressure fermentation for estery and phenolic styles too, intriguingly, and we will get to that later on. With all these things, there's a small downside. There's too much pressure sometimes, and we will go across this as well a little bit later. Too much pressure can stress your yeast, which gives all the usual problems with yeast stress, which can be under attenuation, underperformance, and particularly with pressure fermentation, there is possible foam harm. Sounds a bit dramatic, but we'll investigate that too later. First off, it's all about the yeast, really, and it's how the yeast performs. I guess we know that yeast performs differently. Different yeast strains perform differently because you use different yeast for different flavor profiles, depending on what beer you're making, what you affect you're after. This spreadsheet on the right is from the David Heath Facebook group. David Heath has a YouTube channel, which is very good. Lots of detail, lots of regular videos about all aspects of brewing. Does a bit of pressure fermenting stuff as well. And on his Facebook group, they put up, all the members collaborated on this spreadsheet, which was, what yeast are you using? That's quite hard to say. Write down the temperature and your kind of experiences from it. So it's useful because you've got a whole bunch of yeast down there, and in general, you find out whether they work or not. So in the notes side, people have put things like, no ill effects, all good, excellent, great, which is fine. But I wanted to know what all good meant, really. So with this presentation, I wanted to avoid the whole, it works fine for me business, it tastes great to me. I'm also not trying to do one of those grain to glass in 7 days things, because I want to find out how and why it works. And we can all find out how and why it works. One thing that kind of pricked my eyes or ears, both, I think, in this sheet is like the second one down. This is the one that made me want to find out a little bit more. So SO4 is described as very, very clean tasting when fermented at 12 to 20 psi. And I'm like, you know what? That's SO4 is well known for its nice ale esters. So you could have used any yeast to clamp on loads of pressure and reduce all those esters. So it felt like a bit of a, I used this yeast and I whacked loads of pressure on it and it didn't produce any esters, very clean. And somehow I thought that wasn't a best use of that yeast or the knowledge somehow. So I shall refer you to the how it works. So the Beer Smith podcast from Jan 2018 is the one that really got me into it. It's the mother lode, the holy grail for me. It was, and using it was like a huge step forward for my lagers. I ended up with clean, fast, fully attenuated lagers, which is amazing to kind of be able to do off the bat. This podcast had John Blickman and Chris White. So Blickman Engineering, they make all those fancy, nice homebrew shiny gear. Chris White from White Labs, who was one of the biggest yeast labs in the world, which I'm sure most of us have used some of their stuff. What they did was an experiment to try to produce a lager at room temperature. So they split a batch into 4, and you can see it on the left there, and on the right as well, if you're already looking. They split a batch, fermented one at normal lager temperature, so like -10 centigrade, one at room temperature with no pressure, one at 1 bar, which is 15 psi, and then one at 2 bar, which is 30 psi. And they basically then fully fermented it out, sent the results off to the lab because they got a lab, which is nice. But it does mean for the rest of us that we got actual proper science numbers back. As a kind of control, at the bottom left, they measured a whole ton of stuff: ABV, pH, IBUs, specific gravity. And if you look across, there's going to be a lot of numbers, by the way, in this presentation, not too many. So I'll try and point towards numbers. Can you see if I move my mouse over this thing? No.
Yes,
Yes.
Oh, you can, good. I'll be pointing, that's my pointy thing. So if you go across these rows, not much changes in the ABV. They're essentially the same. IBUs, essentially the same. Specific gravity is exactly the same. So nothing really changes until you go to the right-hand side of the graph. There's a list there of diacetyl acetaldehyde, a couple of off flavors at the top. The acetates, the next 3 down, are esters, and the alcohols or the ols at the bottom are the fusel alcohols, the higher alcohols. And you notice that numbers are quite different across that graph. So for instance, I might as well start at the top. Lager at 10 centigrade, normal lager produced 32, that's part per billion, because the fresh, at 0 bar, about 10, less than 10. At 1 bar, 12 parts per billion, and 2 bar, 12. Fine. But already that looks like diacetyl is produced less at 1 bar pressure, 15 psi pressure. That's not necessarily just the pressure, that's also because the elevated temperature that was fermented at, which would be room temperature. From my recollection, I didn't write that down, but the whole point was to do the pressurized ones, including the 0 pressurized one, at room temperature. acetaldehyde, there's clearly quite a difference there. So at 1 bar, for example, you've only got 4.2 parts per million, as opposed to the higher numbers either side, but compared to the lager at normal lager temperature, it's about half, which is useful to know. The next 3 down are esters, so the fruity flavors you basically get when you ferment warm, particularly noticeable in the lager. Very quick look at those numbers there. I think particularly to note that at 1 bar, ethyl acetate, which is the solventy flavor, smells a bit like pear drops, nail varnish at different levels. 23 parts per million, as opposed to 33 for the lager, as opposed to 40 at no pressure at room temperature. I should add this was done with a lager yeast, so these esters may be higher than usual. Isoamyl acetate, which is the banana flavory ester, also a lot lower. 50% lower. When you look at the bottom 3, which are the fusels, there's not that much difference. In fact, at pressure, there's a little bit more. So this was their spreadsheet that really got me into it. And that's how I started. Recently, I came across someone else who'd done an experiment, the Zythologist. Thanks, Mark Hopkins, for heading me up here. This is a new channel from a guy who is he's a chemical engineer, home brewer. He's going to start his own brewery as well. This is an amazing video. There's 2 parts to it, and it's like split into like 2.5 hours or something like that. Absolutely loads of detail. Did a very similar experiment to the one we just looked at, but he did it with pale ale. He brewed one at 18 degrees versus one at 22 degrees at 10 psi. So he brewed one slightly higher temperature but under pressure, and then sent it all off to the lab because he's got a lab, or he knows someone who's got a lab, or he works in a uni or something like that, and had very similar results to the things we've just looked at. So the table immediately underneath has got similar results. So the esters there, ethyl acetate, at ambient temperature, so the under the red column was 28, and under pressure it was 14. So again, I like half. Isoamyl acetate, so about halfway down that list, was 4.8 versus 3.6. So I did do the maths. I can't remember what that was. That was about 25 or 40%. I can't remember what it was. And got similar results with the fusels. Not much difference here at the bottom. On the right is his. Stop doing that. On the right is his graph. And if you can see that well enough, the blue is the ambient, and the pressure is the, and the red is the pressure. At the front here, he had results such as the lag time was shorter, the rate of attenuation was faster with pressure, and he reached his final gravity quicker as well. So all of those kind of made me think, well, this is proper science. I was quite excited, to be honest, to find 2 different, and only 2 so far different studies that produce the same results. And crucially, they answered why this happened, why you had cleaner tasting lager. It was down to actually being able to measure the esters and showing what was happening. The next few slides are little clips from his videos. And is everything all right so far, by the way? Do yell. Can you hear me still?
Yep, loud and clear.
All good.
We can hear you, Clem Fandango.
The next few slides is just a little bit of quick science I've nicked from his video, and I've credited him underneath, about how the esters get made and why temperature affects them and why pressure affects them. So I'll run through it real quick because just keeping an eye on the time. Higher temperatures mean more rapid yeast propagation, which increases the esters and the fusels. On the right is a yeast cell. This is his diagram I'm borrowing. So down, there were a lot more pathways of chemical reactions in this, but this is the simple version from his video. At the top, you've got your inputs, which are the sugar and from the wort and the amino acids from the wort as well. Outputs from the yeast are ethanol, acetic acid, some esters, and some higher alcohols. When fermentation has started and you've got ethanol, then these compounds will kind of combine to start producing your esters. So the acetic acid down here combines with the ethanol to give you ethyl acetate, which is the solvent. And there's a couple more down there as well. Acetic acid plus higher alcohols over here give you the banana and the pineapple flavors. So increase the temperature, you increase those, and you'll notice if you've ever done that. Had brewed too warm and got the fruity flavors. If you increase the pressure, then the opposite happens. So yeast metabolism slows, and it slows due to the concentration of CO2. The pressure is not the static pressure as such. It's to do with the concentration of carbon dioxide in the liquid, in the medium, in this case, beer. And that is what is slowing down the metabolism of the yeast, which means it doesn't produce as many esters and produces them at a lower level. And the same with fusels. When you apply the pressure, the esters are significantly reduced. We saw maybe by up to half, and the fusels are reduced as well, but by less. So if you apply both pressure and temperature, you increase the ethanol, the fatty acids, the esters, but the temperature increases that, but the higher pressure decreases all of those as well. So the effect is that you basically can balance out or cancel out even the increase in temperature by applying pressure. It means that you can ferment at a higher temperature under pressure, and you'll get a faster, cleaner fermentation. So that's kind of how it works, esters wise. The next one is from a paper. That's a very small. It's a very small chart. I apologize. This is from a study into a very similar thing from 1992. It's in the references, and they did a very similar thing. Studied the fusels as well as the esters at even higher pressures. So the pressure there is 1, 2, and 3 across the top, which is 15, 30, and 45 psi. So that's pretty high now. And I don't know if you can see that, but ethyl acetate, so the solvents, reduce a lot more. So under 1 bar of pressure, they've got 28 milligrams per liter, which is essentially the same as parts per million. At 2 bar, 30 psi, that's reduced down to 2.2, and then at 3 it's down to 1. So there's hardly anything there as such compared to the lower pressures. The higher pressures are really reducing those fusels a lot. Sorry, those esters a lot, and proportionately the fusels as well. So your question might be, why not just ferment higher then? You know, why not just whack it right up so you can reduce all of those esters and fusels as much as possible? And the answer is to do with the yeast and the effect that that pressure has on the yeast. At 1 bar, 15 psi, this same study showed that the yeast biomass is pretty much unaffected. It's the same pretty much as you would have at normal pressure. But at 30 psi, 30% less yeast is produced because it's harder for it to produce, to reproduce, I beg your pardon, under that pressure. 30% less at 30 psi, and by the time you get 45 psi, it's 70% less biomass to ferment your beer and to clean up your off flavors, that should say. There's a little chart at the bottom there as well, little graph that shows the drop off in the amount of yeast being produced. Additionally, yeast produces proteinase A, which can damage the foam. Not clear at what temperature that happens, to be fair, but it was noted. So that's the reason why not to keep producing, not to keep increasing the temperature. I've combined, on the next slide, hold your hats, because I've combined all of that information all into one slide. I've colored it up, so it's a little bit easier to look at. And apologies that it's a table full of numbers, but I will guide you through it if that's all right. In orange, sorry, I'll do the columns first. So columns are the compounds, and I've combined here the Beersmith numbers, the Zythologist pale ale numbers, and the yeast study that we just looked at. So those three, in fact, three sources anyway. So the compound on the left, the next column is what it smells like, how people mostly describe it. The threshold that humans perceive it at, the range it normally appears in beer, and then the numbers that we just looked at. So this is all just in one master slide, I seem to have called that. The columns down the left, orange is those off flavors, green is esters, yellow is fusels, and purple is the yeast at the bottom. So to help navigate, I have helpfully made a darker color column over here at 15 psi, which you won't be surprised if you know anything about it or have heard anybody talk about it, is the kind of sweet spot for pressure fermenting. And you can see the numbers here. So that's why I've done this slide, really, is to try and capture everything all in one hit. So we've got relatively low levels of diacetyl, of acid aldehyde, of all of these esters here. All of these fusels are roughly the same. And the yeast at the bottom here is at the level you'd expect at normal atmospheric temperature. So if you look to the left of the darker colored column, you see that the numbers are higher, essentially, to the left of the stuff that we're interested in. So especially the esters over here. If you look to the right, pretty much on all of these columns, you'll see it is lower. And that's really just, again, to illustrate that the esters and the fusels will drop with higher pressure, but that is because you have got yet less yeast biomass being produced in the first place to produce the esters and the fusels. And of course, then also you've got less yeast and less active yeast to work at those higher temperatures as well. So the sweet spot is down the middle, 15 psi. So this is what I do. I'm gonna have a sip of beer. Talking of beer, I did send some round. I sent a whole bunch round to maybe half a dozen people or something like that. So we might look at them or talk about them afterwards. I sent round a pale ale, a hoppy pale ale, a German lager, a Märzen, and also a grisette / saison, because I wanted to kind of show that you could do a clean lager, you could do a hoppy pale ale, and you could even do a saison with and still control the esters in each of those different styles. And there's a way of doing that, which we will come on to in one slide's time, 2 slides, no, several slides time. This is what I use. So room temperature is like 20 degrees in here, and I set the spunding valve to 12 to 15 psi. I realized I didn't mention spunding valve earlier on. If people aren't familiar, it's a way of regulating the pressure in the fermenter, in your closed fermenter. And we'll have a look at that in the kit list again in a minute. I made a rule of thumb calculation, which is this second bullet point. I reasoned, for better or worse, because I had to have something, that 15 psi was the kind of equivalent to a drop in temperature of 10 degrees centigrade. And I based that on the original Beer Smith podcast, where the esters and the fusels were at a good level for a clean lager that would traditionally have been brewed at, say, 10 degrees centigrade, if you're still with me. So I reasoned that 1.5 psi equated to a 1 degree drop in temperature. So for a lager, I would apply 15 psi to drop my ambient room temperature to the equivalent, as it were, of 10 degrees centigrade. Just gave me a handle of how to approach different styles. For pale ale, it's different. So I only apply 3 psi because ale yeasts do have esters that you might want. So I've done a kind of blanket approach for pale ale here. And there's an additional very good reason why it's at 3 psi for dry hopping, which we'll look at in a second as well. So 3 psi for an ale yeast would drop your temperature from 20 to 18, which is pretty much an ale fermentation temperature, and would be expected to produce some nice esters off your ale yeast. It's a bit of a rule of thumb and it's a bit of a blanket approach, but that's what I've gone with. And I hope that makes sense. These last 2 points are kind of points for myself, really. I will come back to those. So I'm going to skip on one because it's moving along about halfway through. So once you've made your beer and you've popped it in the fermenter, one of the questions I've seen is, when do you set the pressure? Do you set the pressure at the beginning, or do you set it halfway through, or after primary fermentation, or when? And there are options, and people do it different ways, and there's tons of discussion in Facebook groups and YouTube video comments and blah-de-blah everywhere. Options that I've gone with are, I slap on 15 psi right from the beginning. So I close it up, pressurize it, and leave it alone until it hits final gravity. You could leave it with 0 psi from the start. Sorry, when I say 15 psi from the start, I close it up and I force carbonate. So I use the CO2 cylinder to put 15 psi into it. You know that noise. And then I just leave it alone. Other approaches are not to pressurize it. So you close up the fermenter and you just leave it alone. And when fermentation starts, then when the pressure reaches 15 psi, it'll start off-gassing through your spunding valve, and then you can leave it until final gravity, or you can leave it off until after primary fermentation is finished. I think these are going to be different approaches for different beer styles. I mean, we'll look at these in a few slides' time. Regards pitching yeast, if I'm doing a lager, I will do a normal double-sized lager pitch to compensate for the suppressed growth, because it's pretty much the same as a slow fermenting lager needs. It will ferment slower and at a slower rate than at a high than it would at a higher temperature. So chuck in loads of yeast, usual with a lager. I spun from the beginning to control the esters and possibly any precursors to the esters, and that's because you can never be sure when the lag growth phase is over and the fermentation begins, unless you're up in the middle of the night and you see that little bit of foam on the top. If you can look into your fermenter and see a little bit of foam on the top, and you know fermentation has started. And possibly too late at that point that some of the esters have been formed, especially if your wort is still at 20 degrees centigrade. So, you know, it just feels and sounds wrong. And people know what happens when you ferment your lager yeast at 20 degrees centigrade. It's fruity. So that's one of the reasons I chuck in loads of yeast and give it a load of pressure from the beginning. It's a safeguard, basically, because I don't know when the crossover between the lag growth and the fermentation is going to begin. I'd rather just stamp on it from the beginning, for want of a better expression. This next, I didn't do that slide, did I? That's what I was just talking about on that slide. I forgot to go ahead with one. This is a question that I haven't, this slide is a question I haven't answered yet. I was thinking, if you're reducing the esters and fusels and a lot of the off flavors during fermentation, and because it's a warm fermentation, you're also doing a diacetyl rest at the same time. So you don't need to do a separate one because your temperature is already high enough. Does that reduction in esters and fusels mean that you can cut some time from your maturation and your lagering? I don't know that. And certainly people in this group, and I know people have talked about it already, that there is more to lagering than just letting it sit for ages and letting it clear out. So the clarification of a lager isn't what's happening with the lagering. The smoothing of the flavors of all the edges, all that stuff, the coming together of the, you know, of the beer in the keg is all the lagering. Those are slow, cold chemical reactions. Can they be speeded up if you do that faster? Don't know. There's a great paper called The Biochemistry of Maturation where they, this is in my references as well. I didn't have time to read it, basically. Too much science, my brain was falling out already. So I've left that as for something to do next. But it's interesting, and it's a question and something we can look at. Can you accelerate lagering by already dealing with a lot of the compounds that lagering is supposed to sort out over its 2-3 month lagering period? For another day. Next slide, please. A quick summary of my settings for the styles. So a less intimidating table. After pitching yeast, set your spunding valve to the PSI shown in the table below. There's a lager there. So for clean German Czech lager, set your spunding valve at 15 PSI at your actual room temperature of 20 degrees. My, if you like, Erstats temperature equivalent is 10 degrees. Yeasts I've used with fine success so far, or some success, let me say, are W3470 and Urkel from Imperial, came out both really good. I've used WLP 800 and some Helles stuff as well. I'm still experimenting with those, and we will come on to why later. For a hoppy American IPA, actual room temperature 20, 3 PSIs I've kind of intimated because for a hoppy one, you're going to need to do some dry hopping. But for an estery British ale, which is immediately under it, you want a fermentation of equivalent of 18 degrees because you want the esters out of it. The reason you would do any of these under pressure is to keep oxygen out as well. So that's why I'm looking at doing, so, you know, crazy things like a saison under pressure. You'd think, oh, what's the point in that? Or a wheat beer, what's the point in that? Because that's all about esters, that's all about phenols. But if you have the pressure low enough, you benefit from an oxygen-free ferment and oxygen-free transfer. So basically keeping oxygen out of your beer until the very last, till it touches your lips, people. That's when you want to, that's when you want it to next touch oxygen. So that's my table. It's quite useful, I think. Next, I'm just going to show you how to and how not to do a pale ale. Can already see the not to, I think. So set it for 3 PSI, this hoppy pale ale. And what I do is when it's maybe a point or two away from final gravity, I will release the pressure slowly using the pressure release valve on the top of the either corny keg or the Fermzilla thing, which is what I use. Then I will drop in the hops quietly, as they say, without splashing. And then if you want, clamp it all back up, purge the headspace. And then what I would do is set the spunding valve to 15 PSI. And the way I'm doing it, I think that's kind of crucial because when you put the hops in, there's a lot of nucleation points happening. So the thing basically fizzes up, gives off loads of gas over the next few hours and could basically blow away your hop aroma as it does, or as it can do with an airlock. So all that lovely aroma can escape. If you increase the PSI on the spunding valve, it gives a chance at least for that activity to die down, for the aroma to stay in the liquid or in the headspace at least, and not to escape at all. And if you time it well, and I've timed it well sometimes and I've timed it not so well other times, ideally you want to have no off gassing at all happens. So if you time it really well, like the last 1 point or 2 points or before your final gravity, there's plenty of carbon dioxide to carbonate your beer up to say 12-15 PSI. Anyway, that's something to be able to experiment with, but the point there is to be able to keep the aroma in and not let it come out of your spunding valve. You can smell it as a bad thing in this case. You don't want to smell your nice hops. You want to keep them in. The reason for dry hopping for 3 psi, if you're going to dry hop, is, as we as I slightly mentioned there, you drop dry hops and you've got a lot of nucleation points, and you're going to have a lot of CO2 suddenly want to come out of solution. This is a dry hop volcano from a brewery where they did just that. It's only 11 seconds long. That's all you need.
We can't do it.
Yeah. Don't want to explain that away, do you? Key quote in there, there is nothing that can be done, from someone in the background. Which entertains me every time I watch that. All right so far? Any questions?
All good.
All good, thanks. Just
All
in
good.
case
And just to say, it's always very difficult to get a YouTube clip into any kind of into anything. So you've done very well.
that is in Google Slides, so it's all, they make it work, don't they? Yeah, thanks. Anyway, yeah, thanks. The entertainment worked. The yeasts I've used are, as I say, W3470 and US05 are known as clean fermenters in the first place. So they're great for this because you can use them to their best advantage. I mentioned earlier about repitching slightly. What I have done in the past is, because I've been so excited about it, is have loads of yeast under pressure. Once I've kegged the beer, then I've still got this fermenter full of yeast and full of carbon dioxide, all still under, say, 15 psi pressure. My reasoning had been, well, that will be fine. That will be sanitary. That will last for a few days, and then I'll repitch the next one on top of it. I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, hang on, it's been a week. Or maybe it's like on the same day. And I've done it on the same day sometimes, and I've done it a few days later sometimes. And I'm still experimenting whether it's a good idea or not, because I'm not sure how stressed the yeast has been first time round, and then stressing it all out all over again. So getting it to ferment under pressure again, and then maybe a third time, and then maybe a fourth time. And it feels a bit different than fermenting normally. So just keep repitching at, at normal atmospheric pressure in your normal fermenter. That seems to work just fine. But here, I've felt like it's not necessarily the most efficient. Even visually, sometimes it doesn't clear as well, and I don't know why. It might not be anything, it might be something. I'm still investigating. So as I say, this is all a work in progress still as well, and lots of questions still to answer. Other yeast, I haven't used high pressure yeast. I wanted to look at normal yeasts, really. I looked at the specs for the high pressure yeast. There's a WLP 925 high pressure yeast, £8.49, which is used to, the specs say you can ferment lager in a week at room temperature, 17 to 20 degrees under 15 psi. And final gravity is obtained within a week, which is what I've been getting with other yeasts as well. W3470, £4.50, half the price, has an operating temperature of 9 to 22 degrees centigrade, it says on the packet. I've not done it at 22, not under pressure, at normal room temperature. But the ideal temperature is 10 to 15. The attenuation is the same as the high pressure yeast, about 80%. And you get a nice clean profile. Like, I've not used that either, but I would possibly just refer back to this chart to use if you wanted a beer that had specific esters that you wanted to highlight, but you wanted to have an oxygen-free pressure ferment, then maybe use, you know, a very low PSI. So it doesn't affect your esters, but it does keep the bugs, dust, sneezes out of your beer. We're on to what you need. So if that sounds good, I've got a quick kit list here. I'm aware it's 10 to 9, so I can go through these quite quick. It's basically a shopping list. You might already have some of this. So this is what you would need before buying any extra. Sorry, no, it's not quite true. Let's rewind slightly. You will need a CO2 cylinder if you don't have one already. Can be like 50 quid deposit, and then at the minute the place I use, London Gases, is 36 quid for a refill. I use quite a bit, and I probably refill every 3 months or something like that. I'm quite judicious with it though. You'll need a regulator, 60 notes off Malt Miller, that link is. You'll need a fridge for temperature control, because I think, as I was saying at the beginning, you need to still pay attention to sanitation, temperature control, all of the other things that are good, you know, good normal homebrew practices. Anyway, a fridge, 20 quid off eBay, 10 if you're lucky. Gas line disconnects, connectors, you've probably got a bunch of that lying around, but if you haven't, 30 quid maybe tops. You need to be able to dispense it. Cheapest way to do that is party tap and 10 foot of 3/16 tube. Tenner to you, mate. And then you want to bottle it at the end, which you can do for also like 10 quid if you use something like James Wilson's copyright, the carbonation cap dual connector thing, which he's put on Slack, which is a great way of doing it. And also you can purge your PET bottles with Star San and then do an oxygen-free, fully sanitized bottle fill under pressure, which is amazing for 10 quid. Tap him up after this show. You can get beer gun, Blickman beer gun, ones off AliExpress, various prices, 30, 50, 100 quid, something like that, or counter pressure filler, variously 30 to 100 quid and more. So those are the basics. The actual kit, you may have some of this too. So you may have a keg knocking around already. So this would be the cheapest way to get into it. If you've already got a keg, you've just saved yourself 55 quid. So the only things you would extra need would be the floating dip tube here. And then it's got a little gas tube thing on the end. It's actually slightly longer than a normal gas tube on a corny keg. And that might be just so that the krausen doesn't burst out. You know, so you fill it less or something. Didn't really think that through. This thing is a little filter that will pop on here. I've noticed with this floating dip tube, and other people can maybe help me out if they've had the same thing, that while this floating dip tube floats in your corny keg, I should say that what happens is you take out the liquid tube, you put this gas, very small liquid tube in place, and then you have the floating ball inside the keg. And what that does is enable you to, sorry, someone's saying something. Hello. So the ball floats on top of the beer. So while you're fermenting at the bottom and all the yeast is at the bottom, you can draw clear beer off the top. essentially. And if you've got hoppy beer and if you've dry hopped in it, and the hops are either everywhere or in a bag at the bottom or something, this little guy is like £3.50, and I got that from Brew Keg UK. What are they called? One moment caller. Brew Keg Tap.
Brew Keg Tap.
Thank you. Yeah, that's them.
You can get them from AliExpress for about £1.
Yeah, well handy, those things. I've put them on all of my floaty dip tube things. 2 reasons: they keep the matter out of your pipe, but they also weigh the end down a little bit so it stays under the beer. God, it's annoying sometimes. Keep shuffling the thing around and tapping the side. What else you might need is a spunding valve, 30 quid for this one from the malt miller, or a fancy one, Spundit 2, which is really hard wearing and about 80 quid. That came from America. I got a couple of them. You can get them in Europe now as well, but they are still imported. Really good build, like super solid build, really accurate, really feels good. Maybe a bit more accurate, but not much more so. You know,
we've got Mr. Bumble.
The what? I spun it.
Sorry, no, I didn't. I thought I was on mute, and we've got a bumblebee in the flat. That's all I was saying, and it wasn't to this group. So I'm sorry about that, but that's a first.
Welcome all bees. So that's about 100 quid, or half that if you've already got a corny keg. So you could get going for like 50 quid, for example. Really important, that's why it's in red. Do not use the PRV on a corny keg as a makeshift spunding valve. Kreuzen may clog it, it may not work. And even though a corny keg is rated at 130 PSI, you do not want that going off in any shape or form. And if the valve does go at 20, 30 PSI, you're going to paint your ceiling some color you do not want. Next kit, moving up one, is these Fermzilla style things. So these plastic conicals, see-through, with a pressure ferment kit on the top, and they come with the floating dip tube ball thingy that we just looked at. Various prices you can see down the side. Not so much more, but twice as much potentially. You know, if you've already got a keg, corny keg, which you could use. Plus delivery, I don't know, 150 quid, 200 quid, something like that. You're looking at roughly. 3 different types here. The difference is with this, the third one down, the all-rounder, doesn't have a dump valve at the bottom. Hence, it's quite a lot cheaper because there's less in it, less mechanics. But these other two, the Fermentasaurus and the Fermzilla, both got like a dump valve thing at the bottom, this butterfly valve. So you can dump the trub, whatever you want to call it, and dump the yeast, whatever you want to call it, and collect it afterwards. Makes them easy to clean. They're all easy to clean, really. And you can also view the magic of fermentation through the side. And you can do what I do, which is get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, just go and check on it and see if the foam has started yet. Oh, God, we've all done that, haven't we? Third is, the more expensive version. So this is Unitec Tank 2. This is rated at 15 PSI. Starts at about 1,200 quid, goes up to about 1,800 quid. Or indeed, get yourself a fast getaway driver. You know what I'm saying, people. One of the other advantages, well, that's gear. So coming towards the end, I'm just going to show you quickly an oxygen-free transfer, which you can do with these things. Exactly the same if you would do an oxygen-free transfer between kegs. So see if I can point here. Gas bottle, fermenter, keg. Sounds like Tommy Cooper. One for the teenagers. Oxygen-free transfer is good for any styles of beer, keeping out oxygen, bugs, wild yeast, dust, sneezes, if you will. First off, purge your keg with Star San, either by doing a closed ferment and pushing the Star San out with CO2, and pushing that Star San into another keg. So you've got an empty keg full of CO2, and you've got your a new keg which is now full of Star San, which is sanitizing itself until you need to use it. Importantly, you need the same pressure in both the fermenter and the keg. So do that. Stick a jumper lead from the liquid out of the fermenter to the liquid in on your keg. Connect up the gas. Nothing should happen. Turn on the gas. Nothing should happen as well, until you either increase the pressure on the gas here, or you release a bit of pressure on this spunding valve, and then the beer will flow, and you will fill up your keg with unoxygen touched beer, which is more delicious, I think. So what's next for my process? To be honest, I need to do some slightly tighter temperature control. I think at the beginning, when I got overexcited about pressure fermenting, I was just leaving it in the hall, and it got to 22 degrees on a warm day or something like that. I was thinking, that's fine, because the equivalent is only 12 degrees, but it's possibly not. And over time, I think it can kind of produce some off flavors. So what I would do is, as soon as it's finished fermenting, get it in the fridge, cold crash it, package it up into a keg, and ferment again. So you want to leave it on the yeast a bit to clean up, definitely. Normally I will let it ferment for a week. It will be done in a week, and then I will give it another week to clean up, and then till I see the yeast start to drop, and then I'll cold crash it. If it's a lager, cold crash it like 1 centigrade a day, something like that, so that the yeast doesn't fall asleep. It'll still work, and it will still help clean up even when it's very cold. I've started lagering at minus 1 degree centigrade. A few people have talked about this. Rich Conroy mentioned it, that potentially minus 1 degree centigrade for a week is about the same as lagering for a month at 2 degrees. So I'm trying that out. Again, it will clear much quicker, but do the chemical reactions that we talked about earlier, maturation and lagering, do those chemical reactions still happen, so that you have a nicely lagered lager at the end of a week as opposed to a month, or at the end of 2 weeks as opposed to 2 months? Not sure. Further investigation required, as I say, improvements. Overbuild starters instead of dumping on the yeast cake. The temptation when I'm dumping on a yeast cake is to not clean the fermenter out. So leave the kind of crust of the krausen around the top. While this isn't beer I'm selling, by the way, of course, it's beer I'm experimenting with my homebrew, is to not necessarily clean the fermenter out, just chuck it straight on the top, thinking it's sanitary. But third or fourth time, maybe that crusty krausen is getting a bit old. Maybe that's not a good idea. And maybe the yeast is stressed in any case, if it's been pressure fermented 3 or 4 times in a row. Overbuilding starters, refer to Lee Emmons's marvelous yeast starters presentation, because that's the way to do it, really. It's the proper way. Nice, fresh, clean, healthy, vital yeast straight in your beer, in your wort, rather. I have a pH measuring issue, which I'll talk about later. I can't work out what's going on. Mine seems too high. I looked around, and there's differing opinions whether you should be measuring your mash temperature you're measuring your pH at mash temperature, hot, when it should be reading 5.2, or whether at room temperature, 20 degrees, when it should be reading 5.5. I'm taking a sample, cooling it down to 20 degrees, and I'm getting 5.5, and I'm thinking, well, that's wrong. It should be 5.2. So I'm not sure what's going on, and it matters because pH has an effect on your shelf life, on the flavor stability of the beer. And then the last one on there, investigate whether lagering can be accelerated, as we were talking about earlier. Final slide, some takeaways, a 4-pack of takeaways. It produces, pressure fermenting will produce cleaner beers of all styles, especially lagers. It's faster fermentation. Your gear is tied up for less time. So you could make more beer. Your turnaround time is faster. Keeps oxygen out. It's great for longer shelf life, especially hoppy beers. Can be relatively affordable. If you've got stuff, you've got a fridge, you've got a spare keg, you could probably get started with a floating dip tube and a spunding valve misses for about 50 quid and a few bits and bobs. Some references at the bottom there. The Beersmith podcast, the Zythologist podcast. Thank you both very much, both amazing. Some papers there. I also used the tech malting and brewing manual, which has some amazing stuff in there, proper science stuff that's would be great to turn into homebrew versions. I also use loads of blogs and YouTube channels. The Homebrew Network is a great Aussie guy who does lots of fermentation stuff. The David Heath one, great community, loads of amazing videos, loads of others. As I say, I used some more than others in this presentation. But generally, lots of good info and still lots of questions. But it's an easy thing to do and produces great results. So that's it. Thanks very much. I hope that was all good and you could hear me all right. That's it. Any questions?
Yes.
Nice one, Steve. Thank you very much.
I do have one. I'm not sure if this applies, but wouldn't it under pressure cause or actually kind of make it more prone to autolysis?
Yeah, it's a good one, and I'm not sure. I don't think so though, because during my research I looked up what kills yeast, the amount of atmospheres, the amount of pressure that kills yeast seems really high. It was something like 7,000 atmospheres that would kill yeast, but before that it definitely starts underperforming. But I think at the pressures that we're looking at, like 12 to 15 psi, that kind of sweet spot, it seems to be good. If we look back at the yeast biomass slide at 12 to 15 psi, it seems pretty happy, for want of a better expression. But give it any more pressure than that, like 30 psi, 45, it might. I mean, it's suffering pretty much, and it's probably not going to give you a good ferment, and it might. I don't know if it's going to kill it or autolysize it and give you those autolysis flavors of umami and dead meat and all those hideous things. Don't think so, but I will be looking more at that though. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Steve. I'm drinking your grisette. I don't know how many people you shared your beers with.
I've managed to get about half a dozen round.
Oh, right. Okay. All I could say is it's very phenolic and very clean.
Okay.
I'd almost say it's Brett-like, but not. That's sort of when something, you can smell the farmhouse. Yeah. But I wouldn't actually say there's a reduction in esters. It's actually, I wouldn't guess at all.
Okay.
I do, however, get this sort of very, very, very clean mouthfeel. And I don't know if that's just recipe or the pressure fermentation or the fact that it hasn't been in oxygen, in touch with oxygen.
Yeah, it might be a bit of all of those. The yeast was rescued from a Blauge's Saison because I liked it, and I grew it up. But yeah, that was pressure fermented at 3 psi. So, as you say, I was hoping to keep all of the esters, so not reduce any of them really. That was also fermented at 29 centigrade at 3 psi, so the equivalent of 27 degrees centigrade, right from the off as well. So I didn't even chill it down. As soon as it got to 27 degrees in the kettle, in the fermenter, in the fridge, heat belt on the bottom, 3 psi on the top, off it went. Yeah, it's clean and estery and phenomenal. Yeah, I know what you mean. And I don't know, what do you think? I think it's what I was trying to do with it, but is it right?
I think it's quite intense for a grisette. It's got that Saison aroma where grisette is usually a bit lighter, but that cleanliness on the palate is to die for. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. It's full of Motueka and Nelson Sauvon.
So while I'm talking, I've probably got a lot to say on this topic as well, because I've now made 6 beers in a corny using pressure ferment.
Oh, cool.
I now actually ferment in the corny and actually just don't even transfer it. I just move it straight over into the kegerator. The other difference is I see everyone uses the floating dip tube, but I don't. I just keep the keg as it is normally. And then actually the first bit you pour off when I lager it for a day or two, and then the yeast cake actually sits at the bottom, and I just blow that out with a party tap. I don't use the yeast again. And if there's any yeast that's left in there, it definitely survives. There's no autolysis, and I'll be drinking it even 3 months later. I find this very useful as a sort of using my kegs in a good way. It's just ferment and then drink from that, go, and loving it, absolutely.
Yeah, I know you did a whole bunch last year as well. We were talking about it, yeah. And that's when I said try a Saison, because would it work? And then that's when I reasoned do it at a very low PSI, mainly to take advantage of the oxygen free, really, so I couldn't get my dirty fingers in it, yeah, basically to keep all the esters as much as possible. I think I bet if you fermented it at say 15 or 20, it would kill off a lot of that ester flavor and the phenolic. I'm kind of prepared to do it take one for the team. I might do it. But I didn't want to, really. I just wanted to see if you could put a little bit of pressure on, almost none, and see if it came out the same, which common sense says it probably would. But it's good to hear. It's good to know that it is clean and it's oxygen free and it works. And you've had experience. So you're pouring off like a pint of yeast and then you've got clear beer.
Probably the first pint, and then the next 2 pints are still quite murky. Yeah. But then you just leave it, and then it's clear quite quickly.
Yeah. So that's really good to know. So you don't.
And on that topic, do you find pressurized beers clear at the same pace as non-pressurized?
Compared to a lager that's been sitting 6 weeks, definitely much quicker. I do use gelatin, which I sort of pour in the top. You can do that through the gas valve. If you put gelatin in a PET bottle that's under more pressure than that, and then you can sort of pour it in through the top. And that clears out in a day or two. Okay. But I'm not I like clear beer, but I'm not, at home, I'm not that fussed about it. Yeah.
So I was just wanting to ask Jack, the size, is it a proper keg? So is it 50 litres or?
It's a corny keg. I've found under 15 PSI, I get the biggest Krausen I've had is not even an inch. And I'm just measuring that from what I see afterwards. But even so, I give it a little bit of headspace in case because I don't want it pouring out the spunding valve.
Yeah.
And that's with lager yeasts. I don't know if you do it with the ale yeast, if you'll get more of a Krausen, I don't know. So yeah, it's not been a problem. But so overall, you're doing about 16, 17 liters rather than a 20 liter batch. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do with the rest?
I have a question.
Experiments make sour beer.
Yes, Ken.
I still don't really understand what a spunding valve is. As far as I can tell, it's just for releasing pressure.
Yeah.
In which case, why can't you just use the PRV on your corny?
It's an adjustable PRV, so you can set it to release at a particular pressure.
Does it? Can you set it then so that it releases at a constant rate?
No, at a constant pressure. So when
so
the vessel
when
you're in
reaches
gets
a certain amount, it goes, psh, and then okay.
Yeah, I mean it's a more gentle, like very gentle release, but the further away it gets from the required pressure, the faster it releases. So if you set it to 10 psi, I mean the way you do it is you kind of there's normally a gauge on it, and you'll sort of open up the valve until it drops to a certain amount and then tighten it up again. But when the pressure then builds over that pressure, it will start to release. So
it's worth avoiding the ones that have the brass just the cheap spunding valve type ones, the ones that Kegland do with the proper diaphragm valve are much more reliable. I tried with the brass, basically a plumbing fitting almost, with a little steel ball in the end, and they can get clogged and are very unreliable.
Yeah, no thanks.
Agree.
Yeah. Yeah, the diaphragm style ones are really, really great.
Steve, I've got a quick question on that last slide that was up. When you talking about lagering and whether it was sort of -1 degree or 2 degrees, so it's been under pressure and then you lager it. Do you lager that at actual 2 degrees, or do you increase the pressure so that it's equivalent 2 degrees, or do you a combination of both?
So I'll take it out of the fermenter into the keg and then put it into the fridge at 2 degrees and set the carbonation for whatever 12 to 15 psi as normal. So it's off the yeast at that point. So it's just normal.
Actual 2 degree in the fridge rather than increasing the pressure to almost make a different atmosphere to sort of fake the degree in temperature.
Yeah,
so it's sort of, you've done that under the fermentation and you're just lagering it in real life, as it were.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve, great presentation, very interesting.
Oh, thanks, fantastic.
I got a question about the hops. When you say that you, when you fermenting pressure, you keep more hoppiness in the beer, hop aromas. Did you say it from your experience, or did you read any paper that measured actually the content of terpenes, terpenoids, or aromatic compounds in the beer when fermenting under pressure? Because this is interesting, but I asked a lot of people, even cheap brewers, and they say that they just got that from experience. Not really, there aren't a lot of experiments in that sense. Did you read anything about that?
I didn't read anything about that. Literally, again, from experience, and I've done it both ways. So I was talking about the timing being crucial. And I don't know if Phil Skinner's around, but he came around the other week, and we had a pale ale that I'd managed to time well, so that when I dry hopped, put the lid back on, and turned up the spunding valve to 15. The last bit of fermentation took the carbonation up to 15 psi, and then didn't off gas, so pretty much kept everything in. So we had one of those, and it tasted great. And then we had one, it smelt great. And we had one where I'd mistimed it, where the aroma had been blown off and then just didn't smell like it tasted. Tasted great.
It could be that when you mistime it, you open the keg and some oxygen got in, and just was that lessened of aromas, maybe.
No, not that. It was the mistiming was putting the dry hops in maybe with 3 or 4 or 5 points of fermentation.
Okay, so a lot of CO2 went out of the ferment. Okay.
And took all the aroma with it. So yeah, it was a fine balance, but I mean, I'm sure there's slightly better ways of managing that. Especially if you're fermenting at room temperature and you let the pressure build to say 15 at room temperature, if you then go and cold crash that's the equivalent of something like, I don't know, 10, is it, or 8 psi at 4 degrees centigrade or something like that, whatever you've set to. So potentially you could, which would be undercarbonated for the style, so potentially you could crank the spunding valve after you've dry hopped to something like 26 at room temperature, so that when you've cold crashed it to 4 degrees, it's already at carbonation pressure, like 12 degrees. And that would maybe more likely prevent any gas escaping. It's the only way I've thought of doing it. Although that might, if it's the end of fermentation, you're not going to kill your yeast off really, because the yeast has done its job by then pretty much. I would then maybe not reuse that yeast if I've put 25 psi of pressure on it, even right at the end. And that's why I mentioned the repitching a few times, and I got a gut feeling it's not working somehow.
If you're sure what your final gravity is, and you know for sure how many points you've got left, there are calculators you can use to carbonate with that. Just take the spunding valve off and seal it up, and hopefully take all the guesswork out of it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
and just take it off early. And
yeah, the pale ale I do, you're exactly right. I mean, is always finishing at 10:10, for example. So you could exactly time it and then take the spunding valve off and know the thing's not going to blow.
When
good point. Yeah.
Are you able to tell when fermentation will finish, because if everything is so tightly controlled and you can work it out rather than taking samples and testing them?
Cheers, Mark. Yeah, no, 2 ways. A lot of people do a force ferment at the beginning, so take a bit of the wort and a big chunk of the yeast and keep it out at room temperature and put it on a stir plate and let the thing ferment out really fast and quickly, and it'll attenuate to what it's going to attenuate to. So maybe 10:10, and then that's what your main beer is due to finish at. Or the other way is just the experience of, I know the recipe and I know it's going to finish at 10:10. So either of those 2 ways really, but not excuse me, but not by taking samples and being able to extrapolate where it's going to finish, because sometimes it just doesn't finish where you want it to by doing that method. But yeah, if a forced ferment will give you a really good idea, and also having done it maybe half a dozen times the same way, you know what it should be doing. So you know that if it's going to finish at 10:10, you see it's at 10:13 or 10:12, then jump in, then dry hop, close it up, crank up the spunding valve, bang it in the fridge.
And don't just believe what Beersmith says either. I did that before.
What was that?
Don't just believe what Beersmith tells you it's going to be. Like it's not magical. They don't know.
Oh, what your final gravity?
Yeah, it says final gravity this, and you're like, oh, it'll be that then, and you're like, no.
God damn it! The software.
Okay, so supposing you decided to do a pressure ferment, but you didn't have a spunding valve, and you decided also not to use the PRV. How is your corny going to survive? I mean, I know that cornies can withstand up to 130 psi.
Yeah.
Is that amount of pressure going to be generated over a week's worth of fermentation? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there in case somebody does know.
I don't know how many liters of CO2 are produced in it.
You get about 400 liters of CO2 from a 1050 batch. 20 liters of a 1050 batch will produce about 400 liters of CO2 in the whole ferment. So that's your corny will blow up.
Yeah, it's a lot of CO2.
Yeah. So
considering you've only got a little bit of headspace, you've probably only got about 3-4 liters headspace.
Yeah.
You're fitting 400 liters into 4 liters. That's 100 bar. That's 1,500 psi. I don't think a corny can take that. But does the yeast just give up at some stage? I don't know.
I was going to say the yeast. Presumably, you're going to kill the yeast at some stage.
Yeah.
So it's, but I wouldn't try it out.
It's the yeast versus the corny.
Well,
someone ought to do it with some sugar solution.
But guys, doesn't the PRV blow out at a particular
yeah,
it does. Yeah.
will do.
I can't remember what it's set at. Is it 30 or something like that?
No, it's way more than that. It just depends upon the spring and the PRV. But I mean, the cornies are rated to like 130 psi, but it should release below that.
That's the mother of all bottle bombs.
This calculator
I've actually
says
done.
that- oh, sorry.
Go on, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just put it into one of the Brewer's Friends calculators with the guile method, and if you do the whole batch of like 1048 and bottle it at 1048, it should do 20 volumes of CO2 according to this, which is a lot, but seems like not that much actually for 20 volumes. Yeah, that's a fair amount.
Because it's not all going into that headspace, is it, Jack? Though it's going into the beer as well.
Yeah.
So
That's right. Yeah.
like 18 liters of beer and 4 liters of headspace, and it's absorbed differently. I haven't worked that out yet. What I wanted to do a calculator of my keg is half full, and it's at 10 psi. What do I need to give it a burst of to make sure that it's at the correct serving psi? Do you know what I mean? Because CO2 is absorbed into the liquid at a different rate than it is into the headspace. So the more headspace you've got, maybe the less CO2 you need. I didn't really work it out. Anyway, I'd be interested.
And I've certainly done some accidental pressure fermentation. Certainly when I've been using the Pico, as those of us who have got them know, and those of dump your wort into a small corny keg, or you can certainly do that. And so I've done that in a sort of a 6 litre or 5 litre corny keg, and pitched the yeast and left the PRV closed, and then 4 days later suddenly remembered, oh shit, that shouldn't be closed, should it? And then I've like released it, and then it's just like, and it's like, shut it off, shut it off. So he can certainly get to like 4 days without blowing the keg apart.
Oh, man.
On 4 liters of beer.
Yeah, I've done similar early on when I was mucking around with corny kegs and thought, oh, I'll just put this into the keg a bit early, and didn't put the spunning valve on as I should have done. And yeah, it was a massively overcarbonated beer until I put a spunning valve on it to slowly reduce it down, which worked okay. So.
Oh man.
I had a question actually about the Fermzillas, and just, you know, Steve, how did you move from kind of cornies into Fermzillas, and what's kind of the pros and cons, and I suppose lifespan of them as well?
Yeah, I haven't, to be honest, I haven't used a corny yet. I was about to do it. I was going to try and do one for this, but I didn't get around to doing it. Although I've got the bits. No, I can't see it. I was going to do a tour in a minute of the bits. In fact, I might even do it in a sec. The Fermzilla and the Fermentosaurus, they do have a date on the side where they say you need to pressure test it. It's to full pressure every 2 years or something like that. And then actually, I think it even says stop looking at it like I can see it from it. It says stop using it after a certain date. It's almost like got a use by date.
Yeah, I think there's 4 years on the side of mine.
Yeah, something like that. So it's got that lifespan that yeah, no, I didn't do them. I went from normal plastic fermenters straight into a plastic what's the name? Pressury one. But it made a noticeable difference. It didn't correct all my other mistakes. It just helped with a cleaner ferment. As I say, pay attention to all your other stuff as well still.
Steve, I've done a couple of pressure fermentations, both lagers, and I did it mainly because I haven't got any reliable method of temperature control at lower temperatures. So I wanted to have a go at this, and I've got a couple of 10 or 12 litre corny kegs, and I was really pleased with the results, and I fermented them at about 22 to 25 degrees. The second one, which was a German Helles style, actually brewed a 20 litre batch, and then pressure fermented one, and then fermented the other at normal low temperatures. I haven't got round to doing a side-by-side comparison yet, but tasting them each individually, they taste pretty good, and I'm pretty pleased with the results. So, like you, I'm quite interested in this, and would like to carry on. Maybe try some other styles as well. I have had the pleasure of drinking your Markson. I haven't got great knowledge or experience of drinking Mars, and I've only got a comparison with one that I've made myself, and I think they're quite different. Yours is definitely clean, but I think the bready, the toasty flavors are quite muted, and there's a little bit of very slight tartness underneath, which gives you that nice mouth-watering. I think it's quite nice. I think the difference between yours and mine is the composition of the recipe. I don't know. What did you think of it?
I literally just poured it that second as you were saying it. Yeah, it was. I felt it was a little bit sweet. I think it might have finished a little bit, tiny bit too high.
I think that's balanced by the bitterness that's there. I think it's quite nice.
Yeah, the malt could have done with a bit more depth in the malt. I think I wasn't quite pleased with that, but I was, as you say, I was really after trying out a few different styles to see how clean they would all come out, as it were. Especially like the lagery styles, the ones that didn't need any esters in it, because I think it shouldn't affect the malt flavor or anything. It's just the esters, those compounds, those chemicals that get.
So it's down to recipe composition, which is why
I think so, yeah.
between yours and mine. But no, I'm a fan, and I'm going to crack on with some more experiments with pressure fermenting. Like you.
Send some over. Send some over, Paul. And do a side by side. Thanks. Thanks.
Visit to Concrete Island, maybe.
Indeed. Oh, I can now. We're all allowed. We're doing a brew day at some point. If I learn how to cook.
You said before about like head retention and stuff, like the because I got the grisette and there's definitely more much better head and longer lasting, because that's really nice. And a couple of the others were a bit like thin and dispersed quickly. So maybe that pressure is a because that was lower pressure, wasn't it?
It was, but it was also a lot more wheat in that. Oh, in a minute. One moment, Cora.
Oh, yeah, true.
That's 66% pills. That's got like 14% wheat in there. 10% 10% Vienna. So it's got quite a bit of wheat in it. But yeah, the head retention on that's all right. The others, yeah, the Merzen, not so great head retention. Pale ale was all right. That's got wheat in it as well, and oats. Yeah, more investigation about the proteinase A, which I need to look up a little bit more. Serge knows a bit more about proteinase from his step mashing last month.
Yeah, but you know how it behaves under pressure and all of that stuff. I think you would need to do side by sides around the head retention of pressurized beers.
Yeah, I'm happy to join in with this experiment with everybody. Yeah,
it's something I thought about doing, but I don't have any equipment or space for new equipment to pressure ferment, so I'm afraid I'll have to leave this one for a while.
Oh, I'll look at the head retention for you.
Steve?
Yeah.
What hops were you using in your American Pale Ale? Because that was a really dangerously sessionable beer.
Thanks. And good to see you in Caerphilly. It's Citra Cascade. And it's something like 3-2 Cascade to Citra, something like that, because otherwise it's a bit overwhelming.
Are you playing around with your water at all? You using RO or?
No, that was tap water, but that was actually the hoppiest I've done it. So I really cranked up the sulfates in that. So it's about 3-1 sulfate to chloride, that one. It's settling out a bit now, but when I first tasted it, I was like, oh my God, massively overdone it. But it's actually settled out all right. But yeah, I was quite pleased with that in the end. I think. Yeah,
that was great.
Cheers. There's about 200 grams of hops in that. There's 100 gram dry hop, and then the rest of it is 15, 10, 5 minutes. And then 100 gram dry hop. Without a dry hop volcano, I thank the Lord. There's nothing you can do. Always makes me laugh. In a good way. Not in a sharp kind of way.
Are you using a tilt or an eye spindle or anything like that?
No, no. just taking samples out of a party tap off the top and a hydrometer thing. Now I quite like the look of a tilt or an ice spindle because get amazing data out of it. As like that, the Zythologist guy had some fantastic graphs from his stuff.
Yeah, I use the ice spindle. I think that the pressure has some sort of effect on it, so I don't necessarily use the readout as gospel, but it's certainly, you know, when it's finished, you can see off the graph when it's finished. And obviously, fermenting in a corny, you're not seeing it as you would be in a Fermzilla or something.
Yeah. So, okay, I see. No, that's a really good point, actually.
Would you get a signal out of a corny?
Yeah.
You do. Okay, that's really.
Oh, of course they've got the rubber. Yeah, it's not a Faraday cage, is it? Because you've got a rubber seal around there. You've got
I've never fermented in a Faraday cage. That's for next month. I look forward to seeing that.
If you're using a Raspberry Pi to read the readings, you have to have it quite close to the corny, though, like actually in the fridge rather than outside it.
Okay.
Yeah, I found mine's completely hopeless if I use a corny.
You do have to. I use Brew Pilus, and the antenna does have to be within sort of a couple of feet of the ice spindle to get a signal. But I found if you're using a stainless fermenter, you can break the cage effect by using bits of sticky tape where the clamps go down. That seems to help.
Here are some. Let's see if I can get. I'm looking at a tiny bit of screen.
Yeah,
so
let's do that.
Fermentosaurus with a lager in it, and it's just the nice thing about it is you can see that it's fermenting, and it's also got a little bottle on the bottom. I don't know, can you see that?
Yeah.
So that's got basically bubbles going into it, so it's quite a visual one.
Steve, do they fit in your fridge?
They do. Yeah. So there's a kind of a tall fridge there. If you can see that one. How did those get there? Look at those.
Show off.
How did they get there? So actually, in that fridge there's two cornies at -1. But yeah,
the cleaner's been in.
I wish.
Is that Mark's old fridge?
I don't know. No. Oh God, there's several fridges dotted about in here. But yeah, they do. I got tall fridges off eBay, as I was saying, and those were like, that one was 20 quid off eBay, like the tall one, because it's got shelves in it, and then you can put some beers in the top, or some yeast, or some hops, or something like that. And there's still room for the Ferm/Zilla/Saurus, whatever you want to call it, and the spunding valve on top. There's plenty of room for it in the tall fridge. Yeah. So yeah.
Presumably, Steve, skunking is something that only happens in a finished beer, is it then? That's an odd one.
No, I don't know. I mean, it's an obvious. You're absolutely right. It's a completely obvious question. That even that's sitting under a fluorescent light at the minute.
Yeah.
And it gets daylight. I mean, this flat doesn't have a load of direct daylight, but it bounces off the walls, and skunking doesn't take much. And I haven't noticed it as such, and I don't know if anyone's picked anything up. Lucas did drop me some notes back kindly, and he did mention possibly slight skunking, but he's got an incredible palate. I will say that. I'm not saying he's spotted everything, but I don't know. whether skunking is a finished beer thing or whether it's a fermenting thing. And I would have thought, I mean, they've sold a lot of those things, and part of the pitch, excuse the pun, is to be able to kind of see the fermentation take place, sit cross-legged on the floor and gorp at it all night. We've all done it. And you'd have thought people would have gone, oh, this is shit, because it's skunking my beer entirely if I'm putting hops in it. And it doesn't seem to, and I haven't come across it. And when I did the training course with Phil Turner, he did do some skunking in, some on-purpose skunking in bottles and brought it along, and God, it smells. It really does. And I've got the little bottles of...
It smells good or smells good or smells bad?
Smells so bad, Dennis.
Matter of taste?
We don't have, no, not at all. No, there's no matter of taste. We don't have skunks in this country. And
so what I was thinking was skunk in the sense of how it would relate.
Skunk in terms of what? Sorry.
And I hadn't realised as well, Steve, that the pressure ferment principle works on excess, levels of CO2. I had no idea about that. I thought it was an atmospheric pressure thing.
Yeah, me too. Until quite recently.
Yeah. So presumably that's different to then the ill effects of not having enough oxygen in your wort initially for the yeast to develop smoothly. So if you had a lack of oxygen, well, presumably they're not linked in that way. Otherwise, you'd have issues with pressure fermented beers.
No, you know what? I actually forgot to put that bit in, and that did occur to me the other when I was putting this together yesterday. That one, I didn't realise that until a few weeks ago. Frank, if he's still here, I think he might have gone. Posted about that it's the CO2 concentration that affects the yeast metabolism. And you're right, that made me think, well, in that case, you need to probably oxygenate more to compensate at the very beginning, because CO2 is toxic to yeast, basically, isn't it? It's a waste product it's trying to get rid of. So yeah, I meant to put that in actually, that if you introduce, say, 15 psi pressure right at the beginning of your fermentation, as soon as you put the wort in, put the lid on, squirt 15 psi of CO2 in it, you want to make sure that you've overcompensated with extra oxygen, I would think. That's what you mean, right?
Well, I hadn't realised that it was due to CO2 volume, CO2 quantities, and then I'm probably linking two things that aren't entirely connected. But it made me think, well, I wonder if that's a similar effect to if I don't oxygenate properly and I end up with poor yeast health. Would I also get poor yeast health and low esters? I don't know. I'm probably connecting two things that aren't there. But
no, I don't think so, because it does kind of make sense. It did occur to me the other day as well. I forgot to put it in, but no, definitely it did. I think if you got a lot of CO2 in there that's stressing the yeast, then it's got less. It's taking in less oxygen, or it's got less access to oxygen, or it might.
But I suppose doesn't that only happen just during the initial phases of? Isn't it effectively the oxygen used during the lag phase when the yeast is? It's a different process, isn't it? By the time it gets going and starts producing CO2, it actually doesn't need oxygen as much at that stage. Yeah, but what CO2 pressure does, I believe, it stops yeast from reproducing. But presumably by the time, therefore, it's built up, the pressure's built up, it's done a lot of the hanky-panky by then, or not? Is that?
I don't think so. I feel like there was a Lineman presentation on this aspect at some point, and they were saying that you have to start with a lot of yeast because it basically goes through possibly one division, if that. So your yeast will at best double.
Yeah.
Which is why you need to start with a much higher count because you don't get growth, and through not having growth is when you don't get the esters.
When I've repitched a few times, I was talking to a couple of people about this. I've repitched like a third or a fourth time. I ended up with a lager that had this very odd, dusty, almost dead yeast kind of flavor to it. And then it had got progressively worse in the 3 repitches. And I was trying to work out what it was. I thought I'd killed it. I thought I'd killed the yeast. As someone was mentioning autolysis earlier, I thought I'd killed it. But now having talked about it just like that, like we just have, I'm thinking that it was, because the other thing it had was a very distinct green apple, a lot of fruit esters in it as well. So it made me think that one was unhealthy after having been pressurized so many times. I'm not sure that that's how it works. But also a lack of oxygen, not enough oxygen in that amount of yeast, and then putting more CO2 into it at the beginning of the fermentation may have just... The other thing I did was just split a batch of the yeast into 2 new fermenters. So I think I'm massively underpitched with the vitality, with the amount of oxygen, with the amount of biomass, my new word. Yeah, even though it looked like there was a huge yeast cake in there, it's not, it wasn't well. It wasn't well, Ian, I can tell you. It wasn't happy. So that's why I was thinking what I might do for the next few times is never repitch, clean the thing out, clean the fermenter out, overbuild the starter and just throw brand new healthy starter in every time. It would be interesting to know if it made any difference, because I can tell that I will be able to taste the difference by now. I've done a stupid amount of ferments with it.
I wonder if they've done similar lab-controlled experiments with repitching, because I love repitching, especially for lagers. When by the time you get to a doppelbock, you do not want to be growing that up from starters. Christ,
Yeah, I think you're right. It's gonna work if you do it maybe once or twice or something. I have a gut feeling it's just not working by putting the same recipe of lager on like 3 or 4 times on the same yeast cake. I'm not sure that's either over pitching or big, I don't know. Yeah.
Can I ask a very quick question about autolysis, and a yes or no answer is good enough? A while ago, I brewed a beer. I can't remember what it was. It was a best-ish kind of bitter, and it had an overwhelming soy sauce taste. Is that autolysis? Do you know?
That's more umami.
Yeah. I'm seeing that. That's not, it's umami, isn't it?
How long was the beer on the yeast for?
I think it was longer, perhaps longer than it should have been.
Which was what?
So, maybe 3, maybe 2.5, 3 weeks.
No, it shouldn't autolyse in that short space of time.
Okay. Thanks.
How dark was it, Mark?
Sorry?
How dark was the beer?
It was a darkish beer to begin with. I can't remember anything else about it. It was quite a while ago. It's just that somebody somewhere had suggested autolysis. I didn't really have the time to do much about it, unfortunately. Like, look any further into it, and it was just Steve mentioned autolysis, and it was just something that popped into my head anyway. Sorry, it wasn't a pressure fermentation question at all. So
it's an interesting one then.
No, it's fine to ask. Paul is right. It's highly unlikely to be autolysis after 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, I regularly leave my beers on the yeast for 2 or 3 weeks after they fermented, just because I can't be asked to get round to transferring them. You're going to get some kind of lysing for sure, because some of the cells are definitely going to die. And if you disturb them, then that's when they do break down and release the flavors back into your beer. But to have that kind of flavor pervading your beer from autolysis, you'd have had to have left it on for months and months.
Oh really? Oh, it definitely wasn't that long.
Could it be oxidation, Ken? If there were a lot of dark malts in there, could it be oxidation? I sometimes get soy flavors with my darker beers if they oxidize.
I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was when I was still using a plastic fermenter, and it would have had an airlock in it, and it wouldn't have run dry. Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a question, Steve? It was prompted by the display of medals on the fridge, I mean, for me, it's a really attractive brewing process because I don't have fermentation control, so I want to have a pop at some lagers, and I'm probably going to have to do them at room temp. So to pop a spunding valve on a corny and you know get a good result that way is really interesting to me. But I think, you know, I'm kind of stepping back as a process. How good are the beers? I mean, is it, in your experience, are people meddling and placing in competitions with pressurized beers, or is it just a convenient mechanism for getting round some, you know, byproducts of fermentation and so on?
Yeah, no, very good point. Yeah, no, I mean, joking apart, the reason I did do that I set it up like that, David, you're quite right, is that
brag. Brag.
Yeah, essentially.
Why not?
Yeah, too right.
It was an illustration of, so there are ones up there from Lager Than Life. So from Lab's first national lager competition, I think it was, wasn't it? Like 2 years ago. So I got a first in category for Czech pills there, which was done under pressure, and I think a third in the German pills, and then a third on something else or something like that. So I've picked up a gong with it. I know what you mean about is it a convenient way of just getting rid of some esters, and I was quite aware of that when I was kind of trying to put the presentation together, whether it was that. And I didn't like to think it was, because one, the esters are at some level of esters is what you want in different styles of beers, including lagers, like at very low, very, very low level. And I think I was going to look at, you know, that, in fact, that Marzen is about 9 months old, isn't he? 10 months old, I think. One of the things I was going to look at was like shelf life of having done a pressure ferment, and if it kills off the esters in the first few weeks, do they come back? Do they stay away? Does it make the beer better? Does it make it worse? Does it make it the same as is it comparable to a commercial version? Because I think a lot of commercial breweries do use pressure fermentation to speed up their stuff anyway. I think the macro brewers do that. And German brewers obviously spun at the end to self-carbonate because that's the law, the Reinheitsgebot law. So they're not allowed to add fake CO2. I can't even think of the word. Yeah, I like to think of it as controlling the esters and fusules rather than getting rid of them, because they are supposed to be there. And it's just a lever to pull to be able to, pressure fermentation is a lever to pull to be able to control some of those off flavors or the esters or whatever you want to target. And I think and that's why I kind of sent around a few different styles, ones that relied on having phenolics and esters to show that you could apply a little bit of pressure, because pressure fermentation doesn't mean a blanket 15 psi over every single beer style, because that would just screw some beer styles up. Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think it's covering up esters as such.
But also, David, did you mean that if you pressurize your fermentation like Steve does, that you will win medals and awards for your beer? Is that basically what you're asking?
I think, you know, there is an aspect. I think I mentioned it in a Slack thread, which is you guys have entered competitions, and there are things that you do to bring out the best in your beers, whether it's bottling, fermentation, or, you know, there'll be other considerations that you apply. I've never done it. I'm completely unaware of what they are, so I'm really interested in it. And I think when people talk about brewing techniques, you know, I'm still at the stage where I'm kind of trying to hone a home-based process. You know, I'm not venturing out in new stuff. I will do this because I want to do a lager at home. And I haven't got a fridge or room for one, so this is great. But I'm also interested when there's discussions about process, about how good they get. You know, if this is a process that is producing competition level beer, then it's interesting, not just for the convenience of fermenting, it's actually, or fermentation control, to Steve's point, it's actually producing really top beers as well. All my beers are limited by me, Dennis, so no, I'm under no illusions.
and me, yeah, so yeah, I concur.
But I think that's what I was saying at the beginning. It's just it's part of the whole brewing process. It's just a particular technique for the fermentation. So you still need to pay attention to your temperature control, to your mash, pH, to your sanitation, to your everything else. This only just ticks one box, as it were, in the whole thing. It really is not a magic bullet to win you a competition or anything just because you pressure fermented it. It's just one part of the entire process where you can go, oh, I've been able to control the esters a little bit better by putting it under 8 psi or 3 psi or 15 psi, depending on your beer style or what you want to achieve, I think. So I think
the only way to produce a really good beer is attention to detail and maybe a little bit of luck. I think that always comes in handy.
Yeah, quite. Exactly. Yeah. And you're right, Paul. I think it's detail across the board, really, and this is just one part of that. I mean, we've had presentations where it's all about the yeast, or it's all about the mash step, or it's all about something else. And they're equally important, because they're all potentially weak links in a chain, I guess. You screw one bit up, or the bottling, you've done the perfect everything up until the bottling, and you have a cold, and or whatever it might be, or your bottling is oxidized or something like that, and you fucked up the entire 3 months of work when you bottle it. So they're all important, and I see this as just one part of that, really.
Yeah.
And I've just started counter pressure filling, I think, just to see if I can nail that last bit of the chain a bit, because it's the final weak link at the minute. It's like having an amazing hi-fi but crap speakers. It's like everything else is amazing. You've got expensive speaker wire, but you've got like tinny speakers. And you put a record on, and people just go, or a record like you used to do in the old days. And you put a record, and it just sounds crap. But I see
terrible taste in music.
The crap speakers are like your bottling almost. You've done everything amazing. The band's recorded an amazing record. Blah 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 blah. You've got like amazing amp. You got an amazing cartridge on your needle. Blah blah blah. You got crap speakers, as in your bottling is oxidized. No one cares, because it sounds shit or it tastes a bit rubbish at the end. So you have to have every aspect nailed a bit, really.
If Peter does his presentation next month on his take on how to do a hoppy beer end to end, that would be a good illustration of quite how, the detail at every single stage, because I mean, it's quite frightening when you hear him describe end to end. You suddenly realize quite how you've been dropping the ball on various different parts, and why he keeps winning.
Yeah, and hoppy beers are sort of subject to oxidation more than most, aren't they? So yeah.
That was great, Steve. Thank you. I've got to fly, but that's a brilliant presentation. Super interesting.
Cheers, Ian. Good to see you.
Loads. Lovely to see you all. We'll see you hopefully next month for Hazenbrow. There'll be a few of us talking heads in the corner, will we, on the tasting. Look forward to it.
See ya.
Right. Thank you very much, Steve. Good night, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Cheerio. Cheers.